When I discovered my daughter had stolen $8,000 from my credit card for her dream vacation to Europe, I knew I had to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. What she didn't expect was that her return flight would take her straight to a courtroom, instead of back home. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Alexa Morrison, and I'm a 47-year-old accountant living in Denver, Colorado. I raised my daughter Madison as a single mother after my divorce 12 years ago. Madison just turned 22 and had been living at home while attending community college and working part-time at a local coffee shop. I thought I was doing the right thing by giving her financial support and keeping her on my credit card for emergencies. Madison had always been headstrong, but lately, she'd become increasingly entitled and demanding. She constantly complained about our modest lifestyle, comparing our 2-bedroom apartment to her friends' families who lived in sprawling suburban homes. She'd roll her eyes when I suggested she pick up extra shifts at work, and she'd grown dismissive whenever I tried to discuss budgeting or financial responsibility. The first red flag came in March when I noticed some unusual charges on my American Express statement. There was a $300 charge at a high-end clothing boutique that Madison claimed was for interview clothes, though she hadn't mentioned any job interviews. Then came a $150 charge at an expensive restaurant downtown that she said was for networking with classmates. I questioned these expenses, but Madison became defensive, accusing me of not trusting her and not wanting her to succeed. I should have been more vigilant, but I was working overtime during tax season and barely had time to scrutinize every transaction. Madison had been responsible with the card for 2 years, only using it for gas, groceries, and legitimate school expenses. I made the mistake of assuming her recent behavior was just a phase. In April, Madison started talking obsessively about her friend Jessica's upcoming graduation trip to Europe. Jessica's parents had apparently gifted her an all-expenses-paid month-long tour through Italy, France, and Spain as a reward for completing her bachelor's degree. Madison would come home from work every day with new details about Jessica's itinerary, describing the luxury hotels, the guided tours of the Louvre, the wine tastings in Tuscany, and the shopping sprees in Milan. "It's so unfair," Madison would complain during dinner. "Jessica gets everything handed to her just because her dad owns that construction company. I work just as hard as she does, but I'll never get to experience anything like that." I tried to be sympathetic while also being realistic. "Honey, everyone's financial situation is different. We can start saving for a nice vacation if you'd like, maybe something more modest for next year." Madison's face would darken whenever I suggested scaled-back alternatives. "A weekend in Vegas isn't the same as a month in Europe, Mom. You just don't understand what it's like to watch everyone else live these amazing lives while I'm stuck serving coffee to strangers." As April progressed, Madison's mood swings became more pronounced. She'd spend hours on her laptop, supposedly working on school assignments, but I often caught glimpses of travel websites and Instagram posts from luxury resorts. She started staying out later, claiming she was studying with friends, and she became increasingly secretive about her daily activities. The situation escalated when Jessica actually left for her trip in early May. Madison's social media feeds were flooded with Jessica's photos from Rome, Paris, and Barcelona. Each post seemed to send Madison into a deeper spiral of resentment and self-pity. She'd slam her laptop shut whenever I entered the room, and our conversations became tense and stilted. "I can't take this anymore," Madison announced one evening, while picking at her dinner. "I'm 22 years old, and I've never been anywhere or done anything. All my friends are having these incredible experiences, and I'm just wasting away in this apartment." I felt terrible seeing my daughter so unhappy, but I also knew our financial limitations. As a single mother working in accounting, I made a decent living, but after rent, utilities, groceries, Madison's school expenses, and our basic needs, there wasn't much left over for luxury vacations. I'd been trying to build up our emergency fund and save for Madison's eventual transfer to a 4-year university. I understand you're frustrated, I told her gently. But good things come to those who work for them. If you really want to travel, we can make a plan. Maybe you could pick up more hours at work or look for a better-paying job. We could set a goal for next year. Madison's response was explosive. Next year? Jessica is living her best life right now and you want me to wait another year? I'm already behind everyone else my age. Do you know how embarrassing it is to be 22 and have never left the country? That night, I heard Madison on the phone with someone, speaking in hushed tones that grew more animated as the conversation progressed. I couldn't make out the details, but I heard phrases like, "It's not fair," and "She just doesn't get it," floating through her bedroom door. I assumed she was venting to a friend and didn't think much of it at the time. Over the next few days, Madison's demeanor shifted dramatically. The sulking and complaints stopped, replaced by an almost manic cheerfulness that should have alarmed me. She started humming while doing chores, spent extra time getting ready in the mornings, and even volunteered to cook dinner twice that week. When I complimented her improved mood, she just smiled mysteriously and said she'd been working on some things. On a Thursday evening in mid-May, Madison approached me with unusual excitement. "Mom, I have some amazing news. Remember my friend Sarah from high school? Her family is planning a last-minute trip to Europe, and they invited me to join them. Sarah's parents said they'd cover most of the expenses because they have extra space in their rental properties, and they know how hard I've been working." I was immediately skeptical. I remembered Sarah vaguely, but they hadn't been close friends, and I'd never met her parents. The story seemed too convenient, especially given Madison's recent obsession with European travel. "That's very generous of them," I said carefully. "When would this trip be? And what exactly would be covered?" Madison had clearly prepared for my questions. "They're leaving next Tuesday for 3 weeks. They're covering accommodations and most meals, but I'd need some spending money for souvenirs and activities, maybe like $500 or $600. The timeline felt rushed, and something about Madison's overly casual tone raised red flags. "This is very short notice, honey. I'd like to speak with Sarah's parents directly to understand the arrangement and make sure you'd be properly supervised." Madison's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Of course, but they're super busy with last-minute planning right now. Sarah said her mom would call you this weekend to go over everything." I agreed to wait for the call, though my instincts were telling me something wasn't right. Madison spent the rest of the evening researching travel requirements and making lists of things to pack, her excitement seeming genuine enough that I started to second-guess my suspicions. The weekend came and went without any call from Sarah's mother. When I asked Madison about it on Sunday, she claimed there had been a miscommunication about timing, but assured me the call would come Monday evening. Monday passed without contact, and by Tuesday morning, I was ready to put an end to the charade. "Madison, I haven't heard from Sarah's parents, and I'm not comfortable with you traveling without proper confirmation of the arrangements," I announced over breakfast. Madison's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. "You're being completely unreasonable. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and you're going to ruin it because you need to control every aspect of my life." "I'm being responsible," I replied firmly. "If this trip is legitimate, Sarah's parents will understand the need for proper communication. Until I speak with them directly, you're not going anywhere." Madison stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind her. I assumed she'd gone to work to cool off, and I spent the morning feeling guilty about potentially crushing her dreams, while also knowing I'd made the right decision as her parent. Around noon, I received a text from Madison. "Got called in for an extra shift. We'll be home late. Sorry for overreacting earlier." The message seemed surprisingly mature and conciliatory, which should have been another warning sign. That evening, Madison returned home with red eyes and a subdued demeanor. She apologized for her outburst and admitted that she might have misunderstood some details about the trip. She seemed genuinely remorseful, and I felt relieved that we'd avoided a major conflict. "I'm just disappointed. she said quietly. I really wanted to go somewhere special before I transfer to university next year. I understand, sweetheart, I replied, giving her a hug. We'll plan something together when the timing is better. Madison nodded and retreated to her room, claiming she needed to catch up on homework. I went to bed that night feeling like we'd weathered the storm and restored our relationship. I had no idea that Madison had already set her real plan in motion. 3. Days after our conversation about the supposed Europe trip, I was at work when my phone buzzed with a notification from my credit card company. It was one of those routine alerts I'd signed up for years ago but rarely paid attention to. This one, however, made my blood run cold. Large purchase alert, $247.83 charged to American Express, ending in 4429. My hands trembled as I opened the banking app on my phone. The charge was from Wanderlust Travel Agency, with a timestamp from just 2 hours earlier. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Madison should have been in her morning classes at the community college. I immediately called the number on the back of my credit card. After navigating through an automated system that seemed designed to test my patience, I finally reached a representative named Derek, who spoke with the practiced calm of someone who'd handled thousands of fraud cases. I need to understand this. Charge from Wanderlust Travel Agency, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't authorize any travel purchases. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Derek pulled up my account and began reading details that made my stomach drop. The purchase appears to be for airline tickets and travel insurance. 3 round-trip tickets from Denver International to Rome, Italy, departing tomorrow morning. The booking was made online using the card information, and the billing address matches your account. 3 tickets? I asked, confused. Who are the other passengers? I can see the names here. Madison Morrison, Jessica Chen, and Emma Rodriguez. The primary traveler is listed as Madison Morrison. Jessica Chen. Madison's friend who was supposedly already in Europe with her family. My daughter had been lying about everything. But who was Emma Rodriguez? After confirming that I wanted to dispute the charges and temporarily freeze my card, I hung up and immediately tried calling Madison. Her phone went straight to voicemail. I called the coffee shop, where she worked, and her manager, a tired-sounding woman named Carol, told me Madison had called in sick that morning. Actually, Carol added, she's been acting strange all week. Yesterday she kept checking her phone during her shift, and she seemed really excited about something. She mentioned taking some time off, but she was vague about when she'd be back. Left work immediately and drove home, my mind spinning with questions and anger. How had Madison gotten access to enough information to make such a large purchase? When had she planned this elaborate deception? And who were these friends she was supposedly traveling with? The apartment was empty when I arrived, but Madison's bedroom told a story of hasty packing. Her dresser drawers were half open with clothes, spilling out, and her usual clutter of textbooks and notebooks had been replaced by travel guides and printed boarding passes scattered across her desk. I picked up one of the boarding passes with shaking hands. Madison Morrison, departing Denver at 8:45 a.m. the next morning, destination Rome Fiumicino Airport. The return date was 3 weeks later. My daughter had planned a nearly month-long vacation to Europe using my stolen credit card information. Among the papers on her desk, I found a handwritten itinerary that revealed the scope of her deception. This wasn't just a spontaneous trip. It was an elaborate, pre-planned vacation. She'd booked hotels in Rome, Florence, Paris, and Barcelona. She'd purchased train passes for travel between cities. She'd even researched restaurant reservations and museum tickets. The most shocking discovery was a group text message thread left open on her laptop between Madison, Jessica, and Emma. Reading through their conversations from the past month, I realized that Jessica had never gone to Europe with her family. That had been a complete fabrication designed to make me feel sorry for Madison. Instead, Jessica had been working extra shifts at her retail job to save money for this secret trip. Emma Rodriguez turned out to be Madison's co-worker from the coffee shop, someone I'd never met but who had apparently been Madison's confidant in planning this scheme. Their messages revealed how they'd been researching the best ways to use someone else's credit card without getting caught, and discussing strategies for dealing with parents who don't understand your dreams. One message from Madison to the group, dated just 4 days earlier, made my hands clench into fists. My mom is being such a control freak about everything. She'll never understand that I deserve this trip. I've been working my ass off for 2 years and she expects me to wait even longer? I'm taking what I've earned. What she'd earned. She was justifying stealing thousands of dollars from me as something she deserved. Another message from Jessica showed how they'd planned to cover their tracks. My cousin works at Wanderlust Travel Agency and said she could help us book everything under one transaction so it looks less suspicious. She said if we book everything at once during business hours, it's less likely to trigger fraud alerts. Emma had contributed practical advice. Madison, make sure you're nowhere near your mom when the charge goes through, and maybe leave your phone at home when you go to the airport, just in case she tries to track you. The level of premeditation was staggering. This wasn't an impulsive mistake made by a young adult. It was a calculated theft carried out by someone who'd spent weeks planning how to deceive and steal from her own mother. I scrolled through more messages and discovered they'd also used my card for additional purchases I hadn't noticed yet. Expensive. Luggage from a department store, travel-sized luxury skincare products, new clothes for the trip, and even a professional camera for documenting the experience. The total amount stolen was approaching $8,000. My phone rang, interrupting my investigation. It was Madison. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice artificially bright. "I'm at Jessica's house working on a group project. I might stay here tonight if that's okay. We have a lot to get through." The casual lie, delivered so smoothly while I was staring at evidence of her massive deception, pushed me over the edge. "Madison, I know about the credit card charges. I know about the plane tickets. I know you're planning to leave for Europe tomorrow morning." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Madison finally spoke, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I can explain everything." "Come home immediately," I said. "We're going to have a very serious conversation." "Mom, please don't overreact. It's not as bad as it looks." "Madison, you stole $8,000 from me. You've been lying to me for weeks. You're attempting to leave the country tomorrow using my stolen money. Exactly which part of this isn't as bad as it looks?" I heard muffled voices in the background, and then Madison's voice became more defiant. "I was going to pay you back once I got a better job. This trip is important for my personal growth and development. You wouldn't understand because you've never taken any risks in your life." The audacity of her response left me momentarily speechless. She was trying to frame her theft as some kind of brave entrepreneurial venture. "You have 1 hour to get home or I'm calling the police," I said before hanging up. Madison arrived 45 minutes later, accompanied by Jessica and Emma, and 3 girls looked like they'd been crying, but there was still a defiant set to Madison's jaw that told me she hadn't fully grasped the severity of her situation. "Before anyone says anything," Madison announced as they walked through the door, "I want you to know that this wasn't just my idea. We all contributed to planning this trip, and we all worked hard to make it happen. By stealing my credit card, information, and committing fraud," I replied evenly. Jessica, a petite girl with short black hair and nervous energy, spoke up first. "Mrs. Morrison, I know this looks really bad, but Madison was just trying to make her dreams come true. She talks about you all the time and how hard you work, and she really respects you. She just wanted to experience something amazing before she gets too old." Emma, taller with curly red hair and freckles, nodded eagerly. "And we were totally going to document everything and create like a travel blog or something that could make money. This was kind of like a business investment, I stared at these two girls who had helped my daughter plan and execute a major theft and who were now trying to convince me it was actually a reasonable business venture. "Let me make sure I understand," I said slowly. "You three plan to steal thousands of dollars from me, leave the country without permission, and somehow this was going to result in a profitable travel blog?" "We researched it," Madison said quickly. "There are people who make 6 figures blogging about their travels. We could have paid you back within a year, maybe less." The disconnect between their fantasy and reality was so vast that I almost laughed. Instead, I walked to Madison's desk and picked up the stack of boarding passes and hotel confirmations. "Your flight leaves in 16 hours, I said. "Jessica and Emma, your parents need to know what you've been planning. I'm calling them right now." "Mrs. Morrison, please," Jessica begged. "My parents will kill me. They've been saving for my college tuition, and if they find out I was planning to spend money on a vacation instead of focusing on school, they'll never forgive me." "You should have thought about that before you decided to commit credit card fraud," I replied, reaching for my phone. "Wait," Madison said, stepping between me and her friends. "Don't call their parents. This was my idea, and I'm the one who actually used the credit card. They didn't do anything illegal." For the first time since discovering the theft, I felt a small flicker of pride in my daughter. Despite everything, she was trying to protect her friends from consequences. "Madison, they helped you plan this. They knew you were stealing from me, and they encouraged you to do it. They're accomplices." "But they never touched the credit card," Madison insisted. "I made all the purchases myself. They just helped with research and planning." I looked at Jessica and Emma, both of whom were crying quietly now. They were young and stupid, but Madison was right that they hadn't actually committed the theft itself. They were guilty of terrible judgment and moral bankruptcy, but legally, Madison was the one who'd crossed the line into criminal behavior. "Both of you need to leave," I told them. "Right now. And if I find out either of you had any contact with Madison before this gets resolved, I'll make sure your parents and the police know exactly what role you played in planning this theft." They fled without another word, leaving Madison and me alone in our apartment with the evidence of her betrayal scattered across every surface. Madison collapsed onto our couch, finally seeming to understand that her European adventure wasn't going to happen. "I just wanted something good to happen in my life," she said through tears. "I'm so tired of watching everyone else get opportunities while I work at a coffee shop and live in this tiny apartment. I thought if I could just have this one experience, I could figure out what I really want to do with my life." "So you decided to steal from me," I said, sitting across from her. "Your mother, who has worked 2 jobs to support us, who has sacrificed her own dreams to make sure you had opportunities. You decided I was the person you could steal from." "I was going to pay you back," Madison repeated weakly. "With what money? You make $8 an hour at a part-time job. Even if your ridiculous travel blog fantasy had worked out, you'd stolen almost as much as you make in an entire year." Madison looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "So what happens now?" Madison's question hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. What happens now? I'd been asking myself the same thing since discovering the theft, and I still didn't have a clear answer. Part of me wanted to handle this quietly within our family, to protect Madison from the full legal consequences of her actions. But another part of me, the part that had been betrayed and stolen from by my own daughter, wanted her to face the reality of what she'd done. "I need some time to think," I told her. "Go to your room. Don't touch your phone. Don't contact Jessica or Emma, and don't even think about leaving this apartment." Madison nodded miserably and shuffled toward her bedroom. I heard her door close softly, followed by muffled crying that continued for nearly an hour. I spent that evening on the phone with my credit card company, filing detailed fraud reports and working to reverse the charges. The customer service representative Derek walked me through the process with professional sympathy. Unfortunately, Mrs. Morrison, since the card was used by someone with access to your account information and the billing address matches. The bank will need to investigate whether this constitutes fraud or unauthorized family use. The process could take several weeks. My daughter stole my credit card information and made unauthorized purchases, I said firmly. How is that not fraud? Legally speaking, family members who have been given access to credit card information in the past sometimes have implied permission to use the card. Since your daughter has been an authorized user for 2 years, the bank needs to determine whether she reasonably believed she had permission for these purchases. The bureaucratic language was infuriating. Madison had clearly stolen from me, but because I'd trusted her with access to my financial information in the past, the bank was treating this as a family dispute rather than a clear case of theft. What do I need to do to ensure these charges are reversed? I asked. You have 2 options. You can work with us through the internal dispute process, which typically takes 30 to 45 days and doesn't guarantee full recovery of the funds. Or you can file a police report for credit card fraud, which strengthens your case significantly and usually results in full restitution. File a police report against my own daughter. The words echoed in my mind long after I'd hung up the phone. I barely slept that night, alternating between anger and heartbreak. Madison had not only stolen a significant amount of money from me, but she'd also broken something fundamental in our relationship. How could I ever trust her again? How could I continue to support someone who saw me as a target for theft rather than as her mother? Around 3 a.m., I heard Madison's bedroom door creak open. I lay still, listening as she tiptoed to the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator open, followed by quiet sniffling and the sound of someone trying to cry silently. Despite everything she'd done, my maternal instincts made me want to comfort her. But I forced myself to stay in bed. Madison needed to sit with the consequences of her choices. The next morning, I woke up to find Madison already in the kitchen, making coffee with shaking hands. She'd clearly been awake most of the night, and her eyes were so swollen from crying that she could barely open them. "Mom," she said as soon as she saw me, "I've been thinking all night about what I did, and I want to make this right. I'll get a second job. I'll drop out of school if I have to. I'll do whatever it takes to pay you back." "With what money?" I asked, echoing my question from the night before. "You owe me almost $8,000. At your current salary, it would take you nearly a year to earn that much, and that's before taxes and assuming you have no other expenses." "I'll find a way," Madison insisted. "I'll get a better job. I'll work full-time. I'll sell everything I own. Please don't involve the police. I made a terrible mistake, but I can fix this." Looking at my daughter's desperate face, I felt the first crack in my resolve. She was young and stupid and had made an enormous error in judgment, but she was still my child. The thought of her facing criminal charges and potentially jail time made my chest tighten with panic. "Madison, even if you could pay me back eventually, that doesn't address the real problem here. You betrayed my trust in the worst possible way. You spent weeks lying to my face, planning to steal from me, and then attempted to leave the country with my money. How am I supposed to get past that?" Madison set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "I know I messed up beyond belief. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you to give me a chance to prove that I'm not the person who did this. I was just so jealous and frustrated, and I made the worst decision of my life." "You made dozens of decisions over several weeks," I corrected her. "This wasn't one bad choice. This was a sustained campaign of deception and theft." Before Madison could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize with a local area code. "Mrs. Morrison? This is Janet Chen, Jessica's mother. I think we need to talk." My stomach dropped. Had Jessica told her parents about the theft? Or had they discovered something on their own? "Of course, Mrs. Chen. What can I do for you?" Jessica came home crying last night and told us everything about the trip to Europe and the credit card charges. "My husband and I are absolutely horrified by what these girls were planning. We want to know how we can help make this right." Stepped into my bedroom for privacy, leaving Madison sitting at the kitchen table with a look of terror on her face. "Mrs. Chen, I appreciate you calling. I'm still trying to figure out how to handle this situation. We've been up all night discussing this with Jessica," Janet continued. "She's admitted that she knew Madison was using your credit card without permission, and she feels terrible about her role in planning the trip. We want to contribute toward paying you back, even though Jessica didn't actually make any of the purchases." The offer caught me off guard. Jessica's family was essentially admitting their daughter's moral culpability while offering to help fix a problem they hadn't directly caused. "That's very generous of you, but Jessica didn't steal my money. Madison did. But Jessica encouraged her and helped her plan it. In our family, we believe that being an accessory to wrongdoing makes you partially responsible for the consequences. We've already canceled Jessica's car privileges and her college fund contributions for this semester. We're also making her get a full-time job to contribute to your restitution." I was struck by how seriously Jessica's parents were taking their daughter's role in the situation, especially compared to Madison's attempts to minimize and rationalize her actions. "Mrs. Chen, I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to involve law enforcement. I'm hoping to resolve this within our families if possible. We understand completely, and we support whatever decision you make. But I want you to know that if you do decide to press charges, we won't let Jessica hide behind the fact that she didn't personally use your credit card. She knew what Madison was doing was wrong, and she chose to help anyway." After we hung up, I returned to the kitchen where Madison was still sitting in the same position, staring at her untouched coffee. "That was Jessica's mother," I said. "She knows everything." Madison's face crumpled. "Are they going to call the police?" "They're leaving that decision up to me. But they're taking Jessica's involvement very seriously. She's losing her car, her college funding for this semester, and she's being required to get a full-time job to help pay me back. Jessica's family has money," Madison said quietly. "They can afford to punish her like that. We can't." "That's not the point, Madison. The point is that Jessica's parents understand that their daughter did something wrong, and they're holding her accountable. You're still trying to justify what you did and minimize the consequences." Madison looked up at me with fresh tears in her eyes. "I'm not trying to minimize anything. I know what I did was horrible. I'm just scared of what's going to happen to me." "You should be scared," I replied. "You committed a felony. Credit card fraud can result in serious jail time and permanent criminal charges that will follow you for the rest of your life." The word felony seemed to hit Madison like a physical blow. She doubled over in her chair, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. "I didn't think of it as a felony," she gasped between sobs. "I thought of it as borrowing money from you that I would pay back later." "Madison, taking someone's credit card information and making unauthorized charges is the textbook definition of credit card fraud. The fact that I'm your mother doesn't change the legal reality of what you did." I let her cry for several minutes before continuing. Part of me felt cruel for forcing her to confront the full scope of her actions, but she needed to understand that this wasn't a family disagreement that could be resolved with an apology and a payment plan. When her sobs finally subsided, I sat down across from her at our small kitchen table. "I've been thinking about this all night," I said. "And I keep coming back to the same question. If I don't hold you accountable for this, what does that teach you about consequences and responsibility?" "It teaches me that you love me and you're willing to forgive me when I make mistakes," Madison replied hopefully. "This wasn't a mistake, Madison. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill or accidentally overdrawing your bank account. This was a deliberate, planned theft that you carried out over several weeks while lying to my face every single day." Madison's face fell as she realized her attempt to reframe the situation wasn't working. "So what are you going to do?" she asked, in a small voice. "I'm going to give you a choice," I said, surprising myself with the decision as I spoke. "You can face the consequences of your actions like an adult, or you can continue trying to avoid responsibility like a child." "What does That mean? It means you can voluntarily turn yourself in to the police, confess to credit card fraud, and work with the legal system to make restitution. Or I can file charges against you myself and let you be arrested and prosecuted without your cooperation. Madison stared at me in horror. You want me to turn myself in to the police? I want you to take responsibility for what you did. If you voluntarily surrender and show genuine remorse, you'll likely get a better outcome than if you're arrested and prosecuted as someone who tried to flee the country with stolen money. But either way, I'm going to jail? Maybe. Probably. Not for very long, and possibly not at all if you're cooperative and make full restitution. But yes, there will likely be legal consequences that include probation, community service, and a criminal record. Madison put her head in her hands. My life is over. I'll never get into a good college. I'll never get a decent job. I'll never be able to move past this. Your life isn't over, I said more gently. But it's definitely going to be harder than it would have been if you hadn't decided to steal from me. That's what consequences mean, Madison. Your actions have permanently changed your future. Is there any way to avoid the legal stuff? She asked desperately. What if I paid you back double? What if I worked for free for a year? What if I did community service on my own? Madison, this isn't a negotiation. You committed a serious crime, and there have to be legal consequences. The only choice you have is whether you face those consequences with dignity or whether you're dragged through them while still trying to avoid responsibility. My daughter sat in silence for nearly 15 minutes, occasionally sniffling but no longer crying. I could almost see her processing the reality of her situation and finally understanding that her actions had consequences she couldn't charm or negotiate her way out of. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't the defiant anger or the manipulative desperation she'd shown over the past day. It was something that looked almost like maturity. If I turn myself in, she said slowly, will you come with me? Yes, I replied without hesitation. I'll be there for every step of this process. And will you still love me after I have a criminal record? The question broke my heart. Despite everything she'd done, despite the betrayal and the theft and the lies, she was still my daughter. Madison, I will always love you, but I will never trust you the same way again, and our relationship is going to have to be rebuilt from the ground up. She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that answer. Okay, she said finally. I'll turn myself in, but I want to do one thing first. What do you want to do first? I asked, though I was immediately suspicious of any delay tactics Madison might be planning. I want to call Jessica and Emma and tell them what I'm going to do. They need to hear it from me, and they need to understand that this is my choice, not something you're forcing me to do. The request surprised me. It showed a level of consideration for her friends that I hadn't expected, given how willing she'd been to involve them in her criminal scheme. You have 10 minutes, I said. And I'm listening to every word. Madison nodded and retrieved her phone from her bedroom. She sat at the kitchen table and dialed Jessica's number, putting the call on speaker without me asking. Madison? Jessica's voice was thick with tears. My parents know everything. They're making me get a job, and they took away my car and they said I might have to testify if there's a trial. This is a disaster. Jessica, I need to tell you something, Madison said, her voice steadier than it had been all morning. I've decided to turn myself into the police and confess to everything. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. You're what? Jessica finally whispered. I'm going to the police station today and admitting that I stole my mom's credit card information and made fraudulent purchases. I'm going to tell them that you and Emma didn't know I was doing anything illegal. But Madison, if you confess, you'll definitely go to jail. Maybe if we all just keep quiet and your mom doesn't press charges, this whole thing will blow over. Madison looked at me before responding. Jessica, This isn't going to blow over. I committed a serious crime, and there have to be consequences. My mom gave me a choice between turning myself in or being arrested, and I'd rather do the right thing. This is insane, Jessica said, her voice rising. You're throwing your life away over a stupid vacation. Just tell your mom you're sorry and promise to pay her back. Parents forgive their kids for everything. Not everything, Madison replied quietly. And I don't deserve to be forgiven for this without facing real consequences. I felt a small surge of pride hearing Madison defend the decision to take responsibility, even when her friend was encouraging her to continue avoiding accountability. I have to call Emma too, Madison continued. But I wanted you to know that whatever happens to me, this was my choice. You and Emma shouldn't feel guilty about my decision to confess. After hanging up with Jessica, Madison immediately dialed Emma's number. Emma's reaction was even more dramatic than Jessica's had been. Are you completely out of your mind? Emma shrieked when Madison explained her decision. My mom works at the courthouse, and she says credit card fraud can be like 5 years in prison. You cannot seriously be thinking about confessing. Emma, I already did the crime. Confessing doesn't change that. It just means I'm taking responsibility instead of making my mom drag me through the legal system. This is so stupid, Madison. Your mom is bluffing. Parents don't actually send their own kids to jail. She's just trying to scare you into being more grateful or whatever. Madison looked at me again, and I could see her wavering slightly in the face of Emma's certainty. My mom isn't bluffing, Madison said finally. And even if she was, I still stole $8,000 from her. That's not something I can just apologize for and move on from. Yes, it is, Emma insisted. It's your mom's money, which means it's kind of your money too since you're family. You weren't stealing from a stranger. You were just borrowing from your mom without asking. The twisted logic made my jaw clench. Emma was essentially arguing that family members had a right to steal from each other, which explained a lot about how these girls had justified their actions. Emma, I have to go, Madison said. I'm going to the police station in an hour. Don't do this, Madison. You're ruining your life for no reason. After Madison hung up, she sat quietly for a moment, processing her friend's reactions. They think I'm making a mistake, she said. What do you think? I asked. I think they still don't understand how serious this is. They keep talking about it like it's some kind of family disagreement that we can work out privately. But you're right that I committed a real crime with real consequences. I'm proud of you for recognizing that, I said, and I meant it. Despite everything she'd done, Madison was finally showing signs of genuine maturity and accountability. We spent the next hour preparing for what would likely be one of the most difficult days of both our lives. Madison showered and dressed carefully, choosing conservative clothes that would make a good impression. She wrote a brief letter of apology to include with her confession, taking responsibility for her actions and expressing genuine remorse. Should I bring anything else? She asked as we prepared to leave. Just your ID and that letter. The lawyers will handle everything else. Lawyers? Madison looked panicked. I thought I was just going to confess and that would be it. Madison, you're about to admit to committing a felony. You need legal representation to make sure your rights are protected and to help negotiate the best possible outcome. The reality of needing a lawyer seemed to drive home the seriousness of the situation in a way that our previous conversations hadn't. Madison's face went pale, and her hands started shaking again. I'm scared, she admitted as we walked to my car. You should be scared, I replied. But you're doing the right thing, and that's going to count for something. The drive to the Denver Police Department downtown took 25 minutes through unusually heavy traffic. Madison spent most of the journey staring out the window in silence, occasionally taking deep, shaky breaths. I found myself stealing glances at her in the rearview mirror, wondering if this would be the last time I'd see her as a free person for a while. The police station was a gray concrete building that looked exactly like what you'd expect from a government facility built in the 1970s. Madison hesitated as we approached the entrance. Once I walk through those doors, there's no going back, is there? She asked. No, I said honestly. Once you confess, you're in the legal system until this gets resolved. Madison nodded and squared her shoulders. Okay, let's do this. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged black woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened patiently as Madison explained why she was there. You want to confess to credit card fraud? The sergeant asked, clearly surprised. Ma'am, I have. To tell you that most people come here because they've been accused of crimes, not because they want to admit to them. I know, Madison said, but I did something wrong, and I want to take responsibility for it. The sergeant looked at me. Are you her mother? Yes, I'm the victim of the fraud, and I'm here to support her through this process. Well, this is certainly unusual, the sergeant said. Let me get Detective Rodriguez to speak with both of you. We were escorted to a small interview room with fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable plastic chairs. Detective Rodriguez turned out to be a woman in her 40s with graying hair and a weary expression that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of human stupidity over the course of her career. So you want to confess to defrauding your own mother? Detective Rodriguez asked after introductions were made. Can I ask why you're doing this voluntarily? Madison looked at me, then back at the detective. Because I committed a crime and I want to face the consequences instead of making my mom force me to through the court system. Detective Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Most young people in your situation would be begging their parents not to. Press charges. You're telling me you want to be prosecuted? I want to do the right thing, Madison said simply. For the next 2 hours, Detective Rodriguez took Madison's detailed confession. Madison described every aspect of her plan, from the initial decision to steal my credit card information to the specific purchases she'd made to the elaborate lies she'd told to cover her tracks. She also provided Jessica and Emma's contact information and explained their roles in planning the trip, though she emphasized that they hadn't actually participated in the fraud itself. Miss Morrison, Detective Rodriguez said when the confession was complete. I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never had someone your age voluntarily confess to a crime of this magnitude. Usually, young adults try to minimize their involvement or blame someone else. Why are you being so forthcoming? Madison thought for a moment before answering. Because my mom raised me better than this. I forgot that for a while when I was planning this trip, but sitting here now, I remember what she taught me about taking responsibility for my actions. I had to bite my lip to keep from crying. Despite everything Madison had done to betray my trust, hearing her acknowledge the values I'd tried to instill in her made me feel like maybe I hadn't completely failed as a parent. The next step is that you'll be formally arrested and booked, Detective Rodriguez explained. Because you're confessing voluntarily, and this is a nonviolent crime, you'll likely be released on your own recognizance pending trial. But you'll have conditions of release, including staying in the jurisdiction and having no contact with the witnesses in your case. What happens at the trial? Madison asked. That depends on several factors, including your criminal history, your cooperation with the investigation, and whether you accept a plea agreement. Given that this is your first offense and you're confessing voluntarily, the prosecutor will likely offer you a deal that includes restitution, probation, and community service. There's a possibility of jail time, but it's not guaranteed. Madison nodded, absorbing this information with more composure than I'd expected. Detective Rodriguez, I interjected, what's the typical timeline for a case like this? From confession to resolution, usually 3 to 6 months if she accepts a plea deal. If she insists on going to trial, it could take over a year. I don't want to go to trial, Madison said quickly. I did what I'm accused of. I just want to accept whatever punishment is fair and start making things right. Detective Rodriguez smiled slightly. That attitude is going to serve you well in this process. Miss Morrison, judges appreciate defendants who take responsibility instead of wasting the court's time with denials and excuses. The formal arrest process was surprisingly quick and bureaucratic. Madison was fingerprinted, photographed, and briefly placed in a holding cell while the paperwork was processed. I waited in the lobby, feeling like I was in a surreal nightmare where I was watching my daughter voluntarily enter the criminal justice system. 3 hours after we'd arrived at the police station, Madison was released into my custody with a court date scheduled for the following week. She looked exhausted and shaken, but there was something different about her demeanor. The defiance and entitlement that had characterized her behavior over the past month had been replaced by a quiet seriousness that made her seem older. "How do you feel?" I asked as we walked back to the car. "Terrified," Madison admitted, "but also kind of relieved. I've been carrying around this secret for weeks, and it feels good to finally tell the truth about what I did." "What happens now?" I asked, echoing her question from the night before. "Now I hire a lawyer, figure out how to pay you back, and try to rebuild your trust in me," Madison said. "I know it's going to take a long time, and I know you might never fully forgive me, but I want to try." As we drove home in the late afternoon traffic, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed in just 48 hours. 2 days ago, I'd thought my biggest challenge was helping Madison transition to a 4-year university. Now I was dealing with credit card fraud, criminal charges, and the complete breakdown of trust between us. But for the first time since discovering the theft, I felt a small spark of hope that Madison might actually learn from this experience and become a better person because of it. That hope was about to be tested in ways I couldn't have imagined. The hope I'd felt leaving the police station lasted exactly 3 days. That's how long it took for the local news to pick up Madison's story and turn our private family crisis into a public spectacle. I first learned about the media attention when my coworker Sandra approached my desk Tuesday morning with an uncomfortable expression. "Alexa, I don't know if you've seen this, but there's an article about Madison on the Denver Post website," she said quietly, sliding a printed copy across my desk. The headline made my stomach drop. "Local college student voluntarily confesses to $8,000 credit card fraud against mother." Below it was Madison's booking photo, looking young and frightened, next to a stock photo of credit cards and handcuffs. The article was relatively factual, focusing on the unusual nature of a voluntary confession for this type of crime. But the comment section beneath it was a cesspool of judgment and speculation about our family. Strangers were calling Madison everything from a spoiled brat to a criminal mastermind, while others criticized me for raising a thief, or conversely, for destroying my daughter's life by pressing charges. I called Madison immediately after reading the article. "Did you know about this?" I asked when she answered. "Jessica texted me the link an hour ago," Madison said, her voice thick with tears. "Mom, some of these comments are saying I should kill myself rather than waste taxpayer money on a trial. How did this become public information?" "Arrest records are public," I explained, though I was equally disturbed by the online reaction. "Anyone can access them, including reporters." "I can't go to work today," Madison said. "I can't face people staring at me and whispering about what I did. What if my boss sees this and fires me?" The media attention added a layer of public humiliation to an already devastating situation. Madison had been prepared to face legal consequences, but she hadn't anticipated becoming a local news story that would follow her for years to come. That evening, things got worse when a local TV station ran a segment about Madison's case as part of a larger story about credit card fraud trends. They interviewed a financial expert who used Madison's case as an example of how family trust can be exploited by entitled young adults who feel they deserve luxury experiences they can't afford. The expert went on to suggest that parents should never give their children access to credit card information and should monitor their accounts daily to prevent Madison Morrison situations in other families. Watching my daughter's name being used as a cautionary tale on the evening news was surreal and heartbreaking. Madison had become a symbol of millennial entitlement and poor parenting, reduced to a 30-second soundbite that completely ignored the complexity of our situation. The phone started ringing that night with calls from reporters wanting to interview both of us about the case. I declined all requests and advised Madison to do the same, but the attention was relentless. By Thursday, there were photographers waiting outside our apartment building and following Madison to her court-mandated community service orientation. "This is insane," Madison said as we watched a news van park across the street from our building. "I thought confessing would make things easier, not turn me into some kind of celebrity criminal." "Notoriety isn't the same as celebrity," I corrected her, "and this is part of the consequences you're facing. Your actions didn't just affect our family. They affected the community's trust in financial institutions and parent-child relationships." Madison looked at me with confusion. "How did stealing from you affect the community?" It was a question that revealed how much she still didn't understand about the broader implications of her choices. "Madison, every time someone commits credit card fraud, it makes banks more suspicious of legitimate transactions. Every time a young adult steals from their parents, it makes other parents question whether they can trust their own children. Your actions contribute to a larger pattern of behavior that affects everyone." "But I'm just one person," Madison protested. "I'm not responsible for what other people do." "No, but you're responsible for contributing to a problem that's bigger than just our family. That's why this is news, and that's why people are so angry about what you did." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at our door. Through the peephole, I could see a woman in a business suit holding a microphone, flanked by a man with a television camera. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Rebecca Chen from Channel 7 News. We'd love to get your perspective on your daughter's case and how other families can protect themselves from similar situations." I didn't answer, but Madison heard the request and looked stricken. "They want to interview you about how to protect against kids like me," she said quietly. "Madison, you're not a category of person that parents need to protect against. You're someone who made a terrible decision and is facing the consequences." But even as I said it, I could see that the media attention was crushing Madison's spirit in ways that the legal proceedings hadn't. She'd been prepared to face a judge and accept punishment, but she hadn't been prepared to become a public example of everything wrong with young people today. The media circus reached its peak when Jessica's parents decided to give an interview to the Denver Post about their daughter's involvement in the planning. They positioned themselves as responsible parents who had discovered their daughter's poor judgment and were taking appropriate action, while subtly criticizing my decision to involve law enforcement. "We believe in handling family matters within the family," Janet Chen was quoted as saying. "While we understand Mrs. Morrison's anger, we question whether destroying a young person's future with criminal charges is the best way to teach responsibility." The Dai article went on to describe how Jessica was working full-time to contribute to my restitution, while also being supported through this difficult time with family counseling and guidance rather than criminal prosecution. I was furious. The Chens were essentially using Madison's legal troubles to make themselves look like superior parents while undermining my decision to hold my daughter accountable for her crimes. Madison saw the article before I did and called me at work, sobbing hysterically. "Jessica's parents are making it sound like you're a monster for pressing charges," she cried. "They're saying Jessica made a mistake, but I'm a criminal. How is that fair when we planned everything together?" "It's not fair," I admitted. "But it's reality." Jessica's parents chose to handle her involvement privately, and I chose to let the legal system handle your involvement publicly. Both choices have consequences. "I wish I'd never confessed," Madison said through tears. "If I'd kept quiet, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe the charges would have been dropped, or we could have worked something out privately." "Madison, the charges wouldn't have been dropped. The credit card company was already investigating, and they would have traced the purchases back to you eventually. The only difference is that you would have been arrested rather than turning yourself involuntarily. But at least I wouldn't have become a public joke. At least people wouldn't be writing online that I deserve to be beaten up in jail. The comment section vitriol had indeed become increasingly violent and disturbing. Anonymous internet users were suggesting everything from physical violence to hoping Madison would be sexually assaulted in prison. The dehumanizing language was shocking even by internet standards. I'm going to contact the website administrators about the most threatening comments, I told Madison. Some of those cross the line into criminal harassment. It doesn't matter, Madison said miserably. The damage is already done. Even after I serve my sentence and pay you back, this will follow me forever. Employers will Google my name and find these articles. Future landlords will see the news stories. I'll never be able to escape what I did. She was right, and that realization weighed heavily on both of us. In the digital age, youthful mistakes can become permanent scarlet letters that follow people for decades. The situation became even more complicated when Emma Rodriguez's family hired a lawyer and threatened to sue me for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress related to Emma's inclusion in Madison's confession. Their lawyer sent a letter claiming that Madison had falsely implicated an innocent young woman in criminal activity, and that my decision to allow Madison to name Emma in her confession had irreparably damaged Emma's reputation and future prospects. But Emma did help plan the trip, Madison said when I showed her the letter. She researched hotels and helped me figure out the best way to use your credit card without getting caught. How is it defamation to tell the truth? Because Emma's parents are wealthy enough to hire lawyers who can make legal threats whether they have merit or not, I explained. They're hoping to intimidate us into retracting part of your confession or settling out of court. The legal threats added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. Not only were we dealing with Madison's criminal case and the media attention, but now we potentially faced a civil lawsuit from people who had helped plan the original crime. I scheduled a meeting with Madison's court-appointed attorney, Robert Martinez, to discuss the new complications. Martinez was a public defender in his 30s who specialized in financial crimes and had been guardedly optimistic about Madison's case until the media circus began. The publicity is complicating things, Martinez explained during our meeting. The prosecutor is under pressure to make an example of Madison because of the media attention. What might have been resolved with probation and restitution could now result in jail time because the community is demanding justice. How much jail time are we talking about? I asked. Potentially 6 months to 2 years, depending on how the judge responds to public pressure. The prosecutor is also less likely to offer a favorable plea deal when there are cameras outside the courthouse. Madison, who had been quiet during most of the meeting, finally spoke up. Mr. Martinez, what if I withdrew my confession? Could we go back to handling this privately? Martinez shook his head. You can't unconfess to a crime, Madison. Once you've given a sworn statement to police, that confession becomes evidence that can be used against you whether you want it to be or not. So I'm stuck with the consequences of trying to do the right thing? You're stuck with the consequences of committing credit card fraud, Martinez corrected gently. The confession just determined how those consequences would unfold. As we left the lawyer's office, Madison was quieter than I'd seen her since the day she'd turned herself in. The weight of realizing that her legal troubles were worsening rather than improving seemed to crush her remaining optimism about redemption and second chances. I'm starting to think Jessica and Emma were right, she said, as we sat in my car outside the law office. Maybe I should have just kept quiet and let you decide whether to press charges. Madison, keeping quiet wouldn't have made you innocent. It just would have made you a coward in addition to being a thief. Being a coward sounds better than being a national laughingstock facing 2 years in prison. I understood her frustration, but I was also concerned that the media pressure was making her regret taking responsibility rather than regretting the original crime. Are you sorry you stole from me, or are you just sorry you got caught? I asked. Madison considered the question for a long moment before answering. Both, she said honestly. I'm sorry I hurt you and I'm sorry I stole your money. But I'm also really sorry that confessing turned into this nightmare. I thought doing the right thing would make things better, not worse. Sometimes doing the right thing is harder than doing the wrong thing, I replied. That's what makes it the right thing. But even as I said it, I wondered if I was being naive. Maybe there was something to be said for handling family matters privately, without involving law enforcement and media attention. Maybe the Chens had the right idea about protecting their daughter from public consequences while still teaching private lessons. That night, as I watched the local news coverage of Madison's case for the fourth time that week, I began to question whether my insistence on legal accountability was helping or hurting my daughter's chances of learning from her mistakes and rebuilding her life. The doubt would only get worse as Madison's court date approached and the stakes of our very public reckoning became clear. The morning of Madison's sentencing hearing, I woke up at 4 a.m. with my stomach in knots. After 3 months of legal proceedings, media scrutiny, and family turmoil, we were finally going to learn what consequences Madison would face for her crime. The plea negotiations had been more complicated than anyone anticipated. What should have been a straightforward case of a first-time offender accepting responsibility had become a high-profile example that the prosecutor felt pressured to treat harshly. The final plea agreement called for 18 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, full restitution of $7,847.32, and 60 days in county jail with the possibility of work release. 60 days in jail. My 22-year-old daughter was going to spend 2 months behind bars because she'd wanted to go on a vacation to Europe. Madison had barely spoken to me since learning about the jail time a week earlier. She'd accepted the plea deal because her attorney warned that going to trial could result in years in prison. But she was devastated by the reality of incarceration. 18-year-old, murderers get less jail time than I'm getting for using a credit card, she'd said bitterly after signing the plea agreement. 18-year-old murderers usually don't confess to their crimes voluntarily and generate weeks of negative media coverage, I'd replied, though I was privately shocked by the harshness of the sentence myself. As we prepared to leave for the courthouse, Madison moved through our apartment like a ghost. She'd packed a small bag with the items her attorney said she'd be allowed to have in jail: basic toiletries, a few changes of underwear, and 2 books. Everything else would be provided by the county. Are you sure you want to come to the hearing? Madison asked as we stood by the front door. You don't have to watch them take me away in handcuffs. I'm going to be there, I said firmly. I've been with you through every step of this process, and I'm not abandoning you now. Madison nodded, but I could see tears threatening to spill over. Despite everything she'd done, despite the months of stress and embarrassment and legal complications, she was still my daughter, and the thought of watching her be led away to jail was breaking my heart. The courthouse was surrounded by news vans and photographers when we arrived. Madison's case had somehow become a symbol of everything wrong with young people, parenting, and the justice system, depending on who was doing the commenting. The media attention had died down somewhat over the past month, but the sentencing hearing had brought everyone back. Madison, do you regret confessing to the crime? A reporter shouted as we walked up the courthouse steps. Mrs. Morrison, do you think the sentence is appropriate for your daughter's crime? Called another. We ignored the questions and pushed through the crowd, but I could feel Madison trembling beside me. She'd lost weight over the past 3 months and looked fragile, in her conservative navy dress and minimal makeup. Inside the courtroom, I was surprised to see Jessica and her parents sitting in the gallery. Jessica looked nervous and guilty, avoiding eye contact with both Madison and me. Emma and her family were notably absent, probably on the advice of their attorney who was still threatening legal action. Judge Patricia Hendricks was a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and a reputation for tough sentences. She'd been assigned to Madison's case randomly, but her background as a former prosecutor who specialized in financial crimes made her less sympathetic to first-time offenders than Madison's attorney would have preferred. "Miss Morrison," Judge Hendricks began after the formal proceedings were completed, "you have pleaded guilty to one count of credit card fraud in the amount of $7,847.32. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything you'd like to say to the court?" Madison stood slowly, her hands shaking as she held a piece of paper with her prepared statement. "Your Honor, I want to start by saying that I take full responsibility for what I did. I stole money from my mother, who has worked her entire life to support me and give me opportunities. I betrayed her trust in the worst possible way, and there's no excuse for my actions." Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling as she continued reading. "I know that what I did was wrong, not just legally, but morally. I hurt my mother, I disappointed my family, and I set a terrible example for other young people who might be watching this case. I understand that there have to be consequences for what I did, and I'm prepared to accept whatever sentence you think is appropriate." Madison paused and looked up from her paper, speaking directly to the judge. "I also want to say that confessing to this crime was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most important. My mother raised me to take responsibility for my actions. And even though I forgot that lesson when I was planning this trip, I remembered it when I had to decide how to face the consequences. I'm grateful that she gave me the chance to do the right thing, even though it was too late to undo the damage I'd caused." She sat down, and I felt tears sliding down my cheeks. Despite everything that had happened, despite the media circus and the legal complications and the family stress, Madison had grown up over the past 3 months. The young woman sitting next to me was more mature and self-aware than the entitled girl who had stolen my credit card information. Judge Hendricks reviewed the plea agreement and the sentencing recommendations before addressing the courtroom. "Miss Morrison, this case has received significant public attention, and I've been made aware of the community's strong feelings about your crime. Credit card fraud affects not just individual victims, but the entire financial system that our society depends on. When young people steal from their own families, it undermines the basic trust that holds communities together." She paused and looked directly at Madison. "However, I've also considered the unusual circumstances of your case. You confessed voluntarily to a crime that might never have been discovered. You accepted responsibility from the beginning and haven't attempted to minimize your actions or blame others. These factors are significant mitigating circumstances that I cannot ignore." I held my breath, hoping that the judge might reduce the jail sentence based on Madison's cooperation. "Therefore, I am accepting the plea agreement as negotiated. You are sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and full restitution to the victim. However, I am suspending the 60-day jail sentence on the condition that you complete your probation successfully and commit no new crimes during that period." Madison gasped audibly. "No jail time. She wasn't going to prison." "Miss Morrison," Judge Hendricks continued, "if you violate any terms of your probation or commit any new crimes during the next 18 months, you will serve the full 60-day sentence in addition to any new penalties. Do you understand these conditions?" "Yes, Your Honor," Madison said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The terms of your probation include monthly meetings with a probation officer, maintaining steady employment or enrollment in school, performing community service at a location approved by the court, and making monthly restitution payments to your mother. You are also prohibited from applying for any credit cards or loans without written permission from your probation officer." The judge banged her gavel, and suddenly the hearing was over. Madison wasn't going to jail. She would be coming home with me that day. As we left the courtroom, Madison collapsed into my arms, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. The stress of the past 3 months, the fear of incarceration, and the overwhelming gratitude for a second chance all poured out at once. "Thank you," she whispered between sobs. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for making me take responsibility. Thank you for being there through all of this." The reporters outside shouted questions about the suspended sentence and whether we felt justice had been served, but we ignored them and headed straight to my car. For the first time in months, I felt like we might actually be able to move forward and rebuild our relationship. The relief didn't last long. That evening, the local news coverage focused heavily on the suspended jail sentence, with several commentators criticizing Judge Hendricks for being too lenient on a privileged young woman who stole from her hardworking mother. The comments sections exploded with outrage that Madison had gotten away with her crime without serving real prison time. "This is exactly what's wrong with our justice system," one commenter wrote. "Rich kids can steal thousands of dollars and walk away with a slap on the wrist while poor people go to prison for stealing food." Madison wasn't rich, and she hadn't walked away without consequences. But the narrative of privilege and unfair treatment dominated the online discussion. Several people even started a petition demanding that the district attorney appeal the sentence and seek jail time. "I can't win," Madison said as we watched the evening news coverage together. "When I was facing jail time, people said I deserved it. Now that I'm not going to jail, people say the system is corrupt. What am I supposed to do with all this hatred?" "You're supposed to ignore it and focus on rebuilding your life," I replied. "The internet outrage will die down eventually, but the work you do to make amends and prove that you've learned from this will last forever." But privately, I was beginning to understand how toxic the media attention had become for both of us. Madison's case had become a symbol that people used to express their frustrations about inequality, privilege, and justice, rather than being seen as the story of a young woman who'd made a terrible mistake and was trying to make it right. Over the next week, Madison threw herself into the requirements of her sentence with impressive dedication. She arranged to perform her community service at a local nonprofit that helped low-income families with financial literacy, recognizing the irony of teaching responsible money management after her own financial crimes. She also started working extra shifts at the coffee shop and picked up a second job at a retail store to maximize her ability to make restitution payments. Her probation officer, a middle-aged man named Carl Williams, was impressed by Madison's commitment to completing her sentence ahead of schedule. Most first-time offenders try to do the bare minimum to satisfy their probation requirements, Carl told me during a family meeting. Madison is doing everything she can to exceed expectations and demonstrate genuine rehabilitation. Madison had also started seeing a therapist to address the underlying issues that had led to her crime. Dr. Sarah Kim specialized in working with young adults who had committed financial crimes, and she helped Madison understand the complex emotions and thought patterns that had justified her theft. Madison's case is interesting because she didn't steal out of desperation or addiction, Dr. Kim explained to me with Madison's permission. She stole because she felt entitled to experiences that she couldn't afford. Working through those feelings of entitlement and learning to find satisfaction in earned achievements is going to be a long process. The therapy sessions were revealing patterns I hadn't recognized before. Madison's resentment about our modest lifestyle hadn't developed overnight. It had been building for years as she compared our situation to those of her friends' families. Social media had amplified these feelings by constantly exposing her to luxury experiences that seemed normal and achievable for everyone except her. I started thinking that everyone else was getting things handed to them while I was being held back by having a responsible parent, Madison explained during one of our joint therapy sessions. I convinced myself that you were being unfairly strict and that I deserved the same opportunities as my friends, even if I had to take them myself. But those opportunities weren't being handed to your friends, I pointed out. Their parents worked for years to be able to afford those experiences. I know that now, Madison said. But when I was planning the trip, I wasn't thinking about anyone else's hard work. I was just thinking about what I wanted and how to get it. The therapy was helping both of us understand how Madison's crime had developed over time and how to prevent similar problems in the future. But it was also forcing us to confront some painful realities about our relationship and communication patterns that had contributed to the situation. Dr. Kim helped us establish new boundaries and expectations that would rebuild trust while still allowing Madison to develop independence. Madison would continue living at home while she completed her probation, but she would pay rent and contribute to household expenses. She would also have complete transparency about her finances, including shared access to her bank accounts and spending records. Trust has to be earned back gradually, Dr. Kim explained. Madison can't expect to regain your confidence immediately, and Alexa can't expect to feel secure about Madison's choices without verification and accountability. 3 months after the sentencing hearing, our lives had settled into a new routine that felt sustainable, if not entirely comfortable. Madison was working 40 hours a week between her 2 jobs, completing her community service on weekends and making steady progress on her restitution payments. She'd also enrolled in evening classes at the community college to continue working toward her bachelor's degree. The media attention had finally died down, though Madison's story occasionally resurfaced when other credit card fraud cases made the news. She'd learned to avoid reading about herself online and focused instead on the concrete steps she could take to rebuild her life and our relationship. One evening in late fall, as we were having dinner together, Madison looked up from her homework and asked a question that surprised me. "Mom, do you think I'm a different person now than I was before all this happened?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "I think you're the same person with a much better understanding of who you want to be," I said. "The Madison who stole from me was still you, but it was you at your worst moment, influenced by jealousy and entitlement and poor judgment. The Madison sitting here now is you at a better moment, influenced by accountability and hard work and genuine remorse." Madison nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that a lot. I keep wondering if I would have eventually learned these lessons without getting arrested and having to go through all the legal stuff. Like maybe I could have grown up and become more responsible just through normal life experiences." "Maybe," I acknowledged, "but maybe not. Some people learn from watching others make mistakes, and some people have to make the mistakes themselves. You're someone who had to learn the hard way." "Do you regret making me turn myself in?" Madison asked. "Would you handle things differently if you could go back?" It was a question I'd asked myself many times over the past 6 months. Would our family have been better off if I'd handled Madison's theft privately, the way Jessica's parents had handled her involvement? "I don't regret holding you accountable," I said finally. "But I do regret how public and painful the process became. I wish there had been a way to teach you these lessons without destroying your privacy and putting you through months of public humiliation. But if you hadn't made me face real consequences, would I have really learned anything?" Madison asked. "Jessica's parents made her get a job and took away her car, but she still thinks what we did was basically okay. She still blames you for overreacting instead of taking responsibility for her own choices." That was true. In the month since the sentencing, Jessica had made several comments suggesting that Madison's legal troubles were excessive punishment for what she still viewed as a family disagreement, rather than a serious crime. "I think you would have learned eventually," I said, "but probably not as quickly or as thoroughly as you did by facing real consequences." Madison smiled slightly. "So you're saying I'm lucky that you're such a hard ass?" "I'm saying you're lucky that you have a mother who loves you enough to let you face the consequences of your actions instead of protecting you from them." As winter approached and Madison's probation continued, I began to feel cautiously optimistic about our future. The legal case was behind us, the media attention had faded, and Madison was demonstrating genuine commitment to making amends and rebuilding trust. But I should have known that the story wasn't over yet. One final twist was waiting for us that would test everything we'd learned about accountability, forgiveness, and the true meaning of consequences. The final twist came 15 months after Madison's sentencing, just 3 months before her probation was set to end. I was at work when my phone rang with a call from an unknown number that I almost didn't answer. "Mrs. Morrison? This is Detective Rodriguez from the Denver Police Department. We met during your daughter's case last year." My blood went cold. Had Madison violated her probation somehow? Had she committed another crime? "What can I do for you, Detective?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm calling because we've made some arrests in a larger credit card fraud ring, and your daughter's case has become relevant to our investigation. We need to speak with both of you as soon as possible." "Madison hasn't done anything wrong," I said immediately. "She's been complying with all the terms of her probation." "We're not investigating Madison for new crimes," Detective Rodriguez clarified. "We're investigating the people who helped her commit the original crime, and we need her testimony to build our case." It turned out that Emma Rodriguez's family lawyer had been more worried about criminal exposure than anyone realized. During the investigation triggered by Madison's confession, police had discovered that Emma's older brother, Carlos Rodriguez, was running a sophisticated credit card fraud operation that targeted college students and their families. Carlos had been recruiting young people to steal financial information from their parents and relatives, providing them with techniques for avoiding detection and promising them a share of the profits from larger fraud schemes. Emma hadn't just helped Madison plan a vacation, she'd been directed by her brother to identify Madison as a potential recruit for his criminal enterprise. Madison was never supposed to confess, Detective Rodriguez explained during our meeting at the police station. Carlos Rodriguez had planned to use her credit card information to make additional purchases after she returned from Europe. Her voluntary confession disrupted a much larger operation that we estimate defrauded families out of over $200,000. Madison was sitting beside me, looking stunned by these revelations. Emma never told me about her brother. She said she was helping me because she wanted to see me happy. "Emma Rodriguez has been cooperating with our investigation since her arrest 2 weeks ago," Detective Rodriguez continued. "She's admitted that her brother instructed her to befriend Madison and encourage her to steal from you. He provided the research about travel booking and credit card fraud techniques that she shared with Madison." "So Madison was being manipulated?" I asked, trying to process this information. "Partially," the detective replied. "Madison still made the choice to steal from you, and she still planned and executed the fraud herself. But she was being guided by someone with much more experience in financial crimes who was planning to exploit her further." The implications were staggering. Madison's theft hadn't been an isolated incident of poor judgment. It had been the beginning of her recruitment into a criminal enterprise. If she hadn't confessed voluntarily, she would have returned from Europe to find herself deeply involved in a major fraud ring. "What does this mean for Madison's case?" I asked. "Nothing. Legally," Detective Rodriguez said. "Madison has already been sentenced and is completing her probation successfully. But the district attorney wants her to testify against Carlos Rodriguez when his case goes to trial. Her testimony about how she was recruited and manipulated could help convict someone who's been exploiting young people for years." Madison looked terrified by the prospect of testifying in another criminal trial. "Do I have to do it?" "You can't be forced to testify," Detective Rodriguez explained. "But your cooperation would be invaluable in stopping someone who's been causing a lot of damage to families like yours." Over the next week, Madison struggled with the decision about whether to testify. On one hand, she wanted to help stop Carlos Rodriguez from manipulating other young people. On the other hand, she was exhausted by legal proceedings and terrified of more media attention. "I finally feel like my life is getting back to normal," Madison told me. "I'm working, I'm in school, I'm paying you back, and people have mostly stopped recognizing me from the news stories. If I testify in another criminal trial, all of that media attention will come back." She was right. The discovery of the larger fraud ring had already generated new news coverage, with Madison's case being described as the tip of the iceberg. that led to the broader investigation. Reporters were calling again, wanting to interview the young woman whose confession brought down a criminal enterprise. Madison's probation officer, Carl Williams, offered perspective during one of our meetings. "Madison, you have an opportunity to turn your worst mistake into something that helps other people," he said. "The choice is yours. But I think you should consider how much good your testimony could do." Madison's therapist, Dr. Kim, helped her work through the decision during their sessions. "This is about completing your redemption arc," Dr. Kim explained to me privately. "Madison has taken responsibility for her actions, made restitution, and demonstrated genuine change. Testifying against the person who exploited her would be the final step in transforming her experience from a purely negative event into something that produces positive outcomes for others." After 2 weeks of deliberation, Madison made her decision. "I'm going to testify," she announced over dinner one evening. "Not because I have to, but because I want to. If my story can help convict someone who's been manipulating families and destroying lives, then maybe some good will come from the worst thing I've ever done." The trial of Carlos Rodriguez took place 8 months later. Madison's testimony was powerful and detailed, describing how Emma had gradually introduced her to the idea of using my credit card without permission and provided specific techniques for avoiding detection. "At first, Emma just seemed like a good friend who understood my frustration about not being able to afford the same experiences as other people," Madison testified. "But looking back, I can see how she was systematically encouraging me to justify stealing from my mother and providing me with the information I needed to commit fraud." The defense attorney tried to argue that Madison was simply an adult who had made her own choices and was now trying to blame someone else for her decisions. But Madison's responses were mature and accountable. "I'm not blaming Emma or her brother for my choice to steal from my mother," she said firmly. "I made that decision myself, and I've accepted full responsibility for it. But I do believe that Carlos Rodriguez deliberately targeted me and other young people, and that he used his sister to manipulate us into committing crimes that benefited him." The jury convicted Carlos Rodriguez on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and exploitation of minors. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to all the families affected by his schemes. Emma Rodriguez accepted a plea deal that included 2 years of probation and community service in exchange for her cooperation. Her parents' threatened lawsuit against us was quietly dropped as part of the plea negotiations. Jessica Chen's parents, who had been so critical of my decision to involve law enforcement, issued a public statement thanking Madison for her courage. In testifying and acknowledging that their private approach to handling Jessica's involvement wouldn't have uncovered the larger criminal enterprise. "We owe Mrs. Morrison and Madison an apology," Janet Chen said in a statement to the Denver Post. "Their decision to pursue legal accountability, which we criticized at the time, ultimately led to the arrest of a career criminal who was exploiting families throughout our community." The statement felt like vindication for the difficult choices we'd made over the past 2 years. The media coverage of Carlos Rodriguez's conviction was overwhelmingly positive, portraying Madison as a young woman who had transformed her personal mistakes into public service. 3 weeks after the trial ended, Madison completed her probation successfully. She'd made her final restitution payment 2 months early, finished 250 hours of community service, 50 more than required, and maintained steady employment and enrollment in school throughout the entire 18-month period. Carl Williams, her probation officer, wrote a letter to Judge Hendricks praising Madison's compliance and personal growth. "In 15 years of supervising probationers, I have rarely seen someone demonstrate such genuine commitment to rehabilitation and accountability," he wrote. "Madison Morrison has not only fulfilled every requirement of her sentence, but has exceeded expectations in her efforts to make amends and contribute positively to her community." On the day Madison's probation officially ended, we went to lunch at a nice restaurant to celebrate. It was the first time in 2 years that we'd gone anywhere together without the shadow of legal proceedings hanging over us. "How does it feel to be a free woman?" I asked as we looked over our menus. "Weird," Madison admitted. "I've gotten so used to checking in with Carl and worrying about violating my probation that I'm not sure what normal life feels like anymore." "What do you want to do now that you're finished with your sentence?" Madison had been thinking about this question for months. "I want to transfer to Colorado State University in the fall and major in criminal justice. I want to work with young people who've gotten involved in financial crimes and help them understand the legal system and their options for rehabilitation." The career choice made perfect sense. Madison's experience with both sides of the criminal justice system had given her unique insights into how young offenders could be helped rather than simply punished. "I also want to start speaking at high schools about the consequences of financial crimes," she continued. "I think a lot of teenagers don't understand how serious credit card fraud is, or how it can destroy their futures. Maybe if they hear from someone who's been through it, they'll make better choices." Over the following year, Madison did exactly what she'd planned. She transferred to CSU, excelled in her criminal justice courses, and began volunteering with a nonprofit that provided legal education to at-risk youth. Her professors were impressed by her practical knowledge and passion for prevention and rehabilitation. She also started a blog about her experience, writing honestly about the thought processes that had led to her crime, the legal consequences she'd faced, and the personal growth she'd achieved through accountability and hard work. The blog gained a modest but engaged following among parents, young adults, and criminal justice professionals. "The most important thing I learned," Madison wrote in one post, "is that taking responsibility for your actions isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily choice to be honest about your mistakes, work hard to make amends, and use your experience to help others avoid similar problems." 2 years after her probation ended, Madison graduated from CSU with honors and was accepted into a master's program in criminal justice administration. She'd also been hired as a program coordinator for the same nonprofit where she'd completed her community service, developing financial literacy and legal education programs for young people. Our relationship had evolved into something stronger and more honest than it had been before her crime. The betrayal and legal proceedings had been devastating, but they'd also forced us to communicate more openly and establish healthier boundaries. "Do you ever regret the way everything happened?" Madison asked me recently as we walked through the park near our apartment. "I regret that you felt desperate enough to steal from me," I said. "I regret that we didn't communicate better before things got to that point. I regret the media circus and the public humiliation you had to endure, but I don't regret holding you accountable for your actions." "I'm glad you made me face the consequences," Madison said. "I'm glad you didn't let me get away with stealing from you just because I'm your daughter. I needed to learn that my actions have real effects on other people, and that taking what I want without permission isn't acceptable no matter how justified I feel." She paused and smiled at me. "Plus, if you hadn't made me confess, I never would have discovered my calling to help other people navigate the criminal justice system. My worst mistake turned into my life's purpose." 5 years have passed since Madison first stole my credit card information to fund her dream vacation to Europe. She never did make it to Europe as a 22-year-old with stolen money, but she earned a trip to Paris last year through a professional development program at her nonprofit job. "It felt completely different traveling somewhere I'd earned the right to visit," she told me when she returned. "I kept thinking about how empty and anxious I would have felt taking that trip with your stolen money, compared to how proud and grateful I felt taking it with money I'd worked for." Madison has now helped dozens of young people understand the legal system and rebuild their lives after making mistakes. She regularly speaks at high schools, community colleges, and parent education programs about financial crimes and their consequences. Her story has become a case study in several criminal justice textbooks as an example of how voluntary confession and genuine accountability can lead to better outcomes than traditional prosecutorial approaches. She's been invited to speak at conferences and law schools about restorative justice and rehabilitation. Sometimes people ask me if I think the consequences I faced were too harsh for my crime, Madison told an audience of law students last month. My answer is always the same. The consequences weren't about the money I stole. They were about the person I was becoming and the person I chose to become instead. As for me, I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is refuse to protect their child from the consequences of their actions. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but it was also the most important. Madison still lives in Denver, working with at-risk youth and finishing her master's degree. We have dinner together every Sunday, and she still helps me with technology problems I can't figure out on my own. Our relationship isn't defined by her past mistakes anymore. It's built on the foundation of accountability, forgiveness, and mutual respect that we establish through the most difficult period of our lives. The credit cards are still in my name only, though. Some lessons, once learned, don't need to be tested again. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.